The king of digital design is on the ropes. The once untouchable Adobe is slowing down. At least that's what's happening on the stock market. Its shares have dropped more than 40%, and some say the worst might still be ahead. That said, be careful. Adobe is still making billions, and its profit margins are massive. So the question is, what on earth is going on? And more importantly, where are we headed? Are we looking at a real collapse, or just an overblown punishment? What exactly is Adobe's business, and what does its future look like? Well, my friends, that's exactly what we're going to find out in this video. Whether Adobe can adapt, or if it's doomed to end up like Kodak. So let's get into it.
Adobe plunges 40%. Can it survive AI?
There was a time when Adobe was untouchable, a giant with no rival in the creative world, the owner of the PDF, the father of Photoshop, the king of the screen. If you wanted to design, edit, create, you had no alternative. But now things have changed. Today, not only is Adobe far from its all-time highs, it's right at the center of the storm. As I mentioned earlier, since January 2024, its shares have plunged more than 40%. And if we look back to the 2021 peak, the loss is close to 50%. In other words, half of its entire value has evaporated. A wipeout of nearly $150 billion in market cap. No small feat, unfortunately. And things, my friends, aren't getting any better. So far in 2025 alone, Adobe's shares are down more than 20%. So there you have it. The former market star has turned into a knife in freefall. The reason? The very same thing that's shaking up the entire world. Artificial intelligence. Suddenly, tools like Midjourney, Runway, Veo, Sonara, or DALL-E promise to create in seconds what used to take hours. And many are wondering, what if Photoshop is no longer necessary? What if Adobe, just like Kodak before it, is showing up late to its own revolution? These are completely reasonable doubts. But hold on, some analysts point out that maybe it's not that simple. Because while everyone is focused on the stock price, the truth is that Adobe is still generating billions in profits, with margins most tech companies could only dream of. And here's the kicker. Right now, it's trading at around 16 times normalized earnings. That's far cheaper than the market average, and much, much cheaper than its usual historical valuation. So the question is, are we looking at the beginning of the end, or an excessive punishment? Are we underestimating one of the most recurring and present companies in the digital world? Or on the contrary, are we clinging to a past that's never coming back? To top it all off, just recently, Figma, a startup Adobe tried to acquire, went public, valued at $50 billion. That's more than double what Adobe was going to pay for it. A third of the market capitalization of today's main character. Was it a strategic mistake to walk away from the deal, or a financial win? Or is this the final proof that Adobe has completely lost its way? Today, on Visualeconomik, we're going to tell a different kind of story. A story of legacy, tough decisions, and a future up for grabs. Because Adobe isn't just a software company, it's a symbol of what it means to adapt or die. And the question hanging in the air is it still the king of digital design, or is it already becoming nothing more than an old memory of the past? Well, if you're ready, let's try to find out. So, let's get into it.
From the CD era to an identity crisis.
Imagine this for a moment. It's the year 2002. In front of you is a desktop computer with a bulky monitor, a ball mouse, and a CD you just inserted into the drive. It's not a game. It's not music. It's Photoshop 7.0. Because yes, before the cloud, before subscriptions, before everything online, this is how the magic began. And even back then, in the early 2000s, Adobe was already part of our lives. Whether you knew it or not, whether you used it directly or not, it didn't matter. Adobe was there. In every contract saved as a PDF, in every poster staring at you from a bus shelter, in every well-designed magazine, every cover, and later, in almost every YouTube tutorial. For years, no one could touch it. Not even giants like Microsoft or Apple could challenge its territory, because Adobe didn't just sell software. Above all, it sold tools for creating. The tools that, in many ways, shaped the new digital world. But like any good story, this one also has a twist, and that twist began with an idea. Do you know what was perhaps the single most important decision Adobe ever made? It wasn't inventing the PDF. It wasn't even Photoshop. No. It was this, turning its desktop programs into services. You see, in the early 2010s, Adobe stopped selling individual licenses. Goodbye to paying $1,000 for Photoshop CS6 and having it forever. Welcome to $9.99 a month. The cloud. The subscription. Recurring revenue. Of course, as you can imagine, many users were up in arms. There were complaints, memes, threats to switch to free alternatives, and plenty of protests. But the change worked, because that decision didn't just stabilize Adobe's revenue, it multiplied it. Because every month, millions of designers, photographers, agencies, universities, and companies started paying up. Do you realize what that meant? It meant Adobe went from being a cyclical company, making a lot when it launched a new version, then watching profits slump, to becoming a steady machine of predictable income. A dream for any investor. And if that weren't enough, Adobe kept expanding its empire. It bought Behance to strengthen its connection with the creative community. It bought Magento to explore e-commerce. And above all, it became obsessed with analytics and digital experience. Adobe stopped being just about design. It also became about marketing, data, and optimization. The result, a company that brought in just over $1 billion in 2002 was generating more than $21 billion by 2024. Yes, a true empire. But you know what they say, the higher you climb, the stronger the wind blows. And that's how 2022 arrived. And with it, by far the most serious threat Adobe has faced since its creation. I am talking, of course, about artificial intelligence. At first, it was just a novelty. A strange sketch here, an invented portrait there. Midjourney, DALL-E, Runway, new names, vague promises. But what can I tell you? In less than 2 years, the creative world was completely turned upside down. Texts that write themselves. Images generated instantly with just a simple prompt. Videos, music, voices, layouts, all without humans in the loop, without hours and hours of painstaking work. And that's when the tremors began. Because if AI can generate a poster, a cover, a photo, a website, why on earth would you need to pay for an Adobe subscription? Why would you need Photoshop? That's the question, and it's what's making more and more investors uneasy. Of course, Adobe didn't just sit back, quite the opposite. It invested at full speed, as fast as it could. It launched Firefly, its own generative AI. It integrated smart features into Photoshop, Illustrator, Premiere, practically every one of its programs. It redesigned its suite to work alongside advanced language models. But still, something had changed. It was no longer the only one. It was no longer setting the pace. And right in that context, Figma appeared, a collaborative, simple, intuitive platform like a Google Docs for visual design to create website layouts, mobile app designs, polished presentations, posters, and so on. And the best part, a system where several people can work at the same time, each from their own computer without installing anything, just with internet access and a browser like Chrome. This not only lets multiple creatives work together, but also makes it possible for them to collaborate directly with programmers and even with their own clients. That's why, almost overnight, professionals across the field started wanting to use it, and Adobe saw it clearly. In a bold move, it announced it was buying the company for $20 billion. And do you know what happened? Adobe's stock price tanked. Many investors saw it as a desperate purchase. Too expensive, too risky, too late. And, as if to add insult to injury, regulators stepped in. The deal was blocked. Adobe backed down, and Figma stayed outside its ecosystem. But the story doesn't end there, because just recently, Figma went public. Did you think the $20 billion Adobe was going to pay for it was expensive? Well, in its IPO, Figma debuted with a $50 billion valuation, shooting up 220% on its first day of trading, crushing the S&P 500's 10-year return in just a few minutes. And that value is more than double what Adobe was going to pay. In fact, it's a little over a third of Adobe's entire market capitalization. What do you think? Do you see that attempted deal differently now? I'm sure you do. What once seemed like a reckless purchase now looks almost like a bargain. A missed opportunity for a company that seems to be speeding headfirst toward the edge. But okay, not all is lost. Despite the pressure, despite AI, despite the new landscape, and despite the blunders, Adobe is still a giant. It's still generating billions, it still has a huge customer base, and it still has something many startups haven't yet managed to build: trust. So the question is, will that still be enough? Will Adobe be able to reinvent itself once again and lead the creative world into the new era? Or will it be remembered as the company that had everything it needed to adapt, but didn't make it in time? Today, more than ever, its legacy and its future are at stake. And with them, one of the most fascinating stories of the digital age.
Strengths and ghosts.
When you sit down to study Adobe, the first thing that stands out isn't just its software, it's its consistency. It's its ability, year after year, to deliver results, improve margins, and remain a key player in a world where technology changes its skin every 6 months. And that's no coincidence. Adobe has been growing non-stop for more than 2 decades. In 2002, the company was generating just $1.1 billion in revenue. Today, it's bringing in around $22 billion. In other words, it has multiplied its sales by 20, and it's done so quietly. No abrupt turns, no mortgaging its future. But wait, that's not even the most impressive part. The real jaw-dropper is that its operating profit has gone from about $300 million to more than $7.8 billion in 2024. That's an increase of no less than 26 times in under 23 years, which is nothing short of staggering. So tell me, aren't these achievements enough to consider it one of the best companies in the world? And of course, logically, this hasn't been the result of mere chance. The key was the shift to the subscription model, the SaaS model, software as a service, which in 2010 made up only 5% of its revenue, and today accounts for more than 90% of all its income. This evolution from one-off sales to subscriptions was an absolutely spectacular success, and that, my friends, shows up in every line of its income statement. And as proof, just look at its profitability. Operating margins, that silent thermometer that tells you whether a business is mediocre or a true gem, speak for themselves. Adobe has gone from having an operating margin of 26% to 36%. And do you know what that means? It means we're not talking about a company that grows by burning cash or giving away subscriptions, not at all. We're talking about a well-oiled structure built to last, a business that not only grows, but charges handsomely for doing so. But of course, the issue now is that there's a heavy shadow hanging over Adobe in 2025. A shadow that has nothing to do with its product or its team. It's a new shadow, silent, disruptive, and a bit treacherous. It is, of course, the artificial intelligence we've already talked about. Because let's be honest, if AI can create an image, a voice, a design, or a video in seconds, why would you keep paying for Photoshop? That's the question many people are asking, especially when you consider the blistering speed at which this technology is advancing. And that's also the reason Adobe has fallen 40% from its 2024 highs. But make no mistake, a drop in the stock market doesn't mean a drop in results. During this time, Adobe hasn't stopped growing. It hasn't lost customers. It hasn't stopped generating cash. What it has done is start moving fast, with quick reflexes, exactly as a leader should. Firefly is the best example. Its generative AI engine, trained on Adobe's own images and licensed content, already allows you to create images, effects, or backgrounds from text. Yes, just like Midjourney or DALL-E, but with one huge advantage: Adobe's legal backing. For designers, agencies, creatives, and big brands, that can be the difference between running a small test or launching a global campaign. And the best part is that Firefly isn't some separate toy. No, it's built right into Creative Cloud, which, in case you didn't know, accounts for 73% of Adobe's total sales. In other words, it's right where the money is. Because, and this is important to keep in mind, Adobe doesn't live off a single program, it lives off the ecosystem it has built and developed over many years. An integrated, professional suite where everything works together. In 2024, out of $21.5 billion in revenue, more than $15.7 billion came from the digital media segment. Photoshop, Illustrator, Premiere, After Effects, InDesign, all these programs and many more, integrated under the same cloud, all running on the subscription model. And let's not forget, we still haven't talked about its other silent gem, Acrobat, the go-to tool for working with PDFs. It may not be glamorous, it may not make headlines, but who hasn't opened a PDF with Adobe in the last 30 days? Acrobat accounts for 13% of revenue, and what's happening there is pretty interesting too. You see, Adobe is starting to integrate artificial intelligence to let you ask questions of a document, generate summaries, extract key data, little features that, once you try them, you can't stop using. You see where this is going? Adobe isn't letting AI take ground away from it. It's actually trying to put AI right at the heart of its products. And that's what could change the angle from which this whole story is seen. Because Adobe has decided not to try to compete against AI, but to try to tame it. In a way, this ties into the bigger debate surrounding this new technology. For some, AI is going to steamroll through, condemning many jobs and products like Adobe to extinction. For others, it will be a tool that multiplies productivity and therefore the value generated by professionals and products in the affected fields. Well, Adobe is clearly betting on this second view of things. But either way, the question is it still attractive as an investment? So let's take a look at the numbers. Right now, Adobe is trading at 16 times this year's normalized earnings. Nothing extreme. But things get interesting when we look to the future. Market consensus estimates annual sales growth of 8.8% over the next 5 years, and operating profit growth of 9.7% per year, reaching $16 billion by 2029. In other words, that would mean earnings per share of nearly $29 by then, compared to the current $18.40. And what about the share price? Today, it's trading at around $340, which means it's trading at just about 12 times normalized future earnings 5 years out. For a company of this quality, with this history, this user base, and this market position, doesn't that sound like an opportunity? Of course, it could also happen that all those forecasts don't pan out, because AI hits much harder. And yes, the fears about artificial intelligence are certainly justified, but we also can't forget Adobe's ability to adapt. If the market is punishing that fear with a discount, we might have, as investors, more than just a solid company in front of us. We might have a misunderstood opportunity. Or maybe not. Maybe it's a value trap. Friends, only time will deliver the verdict. Either way, whenever a company drops 40% on the stock market, the noise becomes deafening. Its cycle is over! AI is going to eat it alive! It's not what it used to be! Pessimism quickly becomes the norm, and there may be some truth to all of that, but it's also true that in the markets, symptoms are often mistaken for the disease, because so far Adobe hasn't stopped growing. It hasn't stopped generating profits. It hasn't lost its user base. What it has lost is the narrative. It's lost that aura of being a hot company, something it clearly no longer has, which now surrounds many others. Of course, the threat is still there. Depending on your perspective, you'll decide whether or not this company fits into your portfolio. In the meantime, there it is, with $22 billion in sales, with 36% margins, with more than $7.8 billion in operating profit, and double-digit growth estimates, with millions of designers, creatives, and companies still relying on its software to operate. And the question is that really worth just 12 times future earnings? This is where it's your turn to decide. Are we looking at a giant in decline, or an opportunity disguised as boredom? Is AI going to sweep Adobe away, or is Adobe going to absorb AI and turn it into an extra engine for growth and value? Is this the moment to look the other way, or to take a much closer look? Tell us what you think down in the comments. Are you following Adobe? Does its evolution convince you, or do you think the worst is yet to come? I insist. Share your thoughts with us. And in the meantime, don't forget to give this video a like if you found it interesting, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Hey, you already watched to the end, you might as well. Take care, see you very soon.